Why can't we be friends? Why can't we be friends? Why can't we?
Hi, everybody. I'm super happy to take you all on this new episode of Common Ground. And here we're taking a bit of a break from bringing on new guests. And I am bringing on the guy who manages the back end of WhatifAltHist. He is my manager, right-hand man, and helps make this magic happen. Also, my best friend, Marek Wright.
Right.
Marek and I have been working together for a couple years, and he manages the business side of the show. He takes care of contracts. He adds the stock footage in, gives me advice, and makes it so that I can do the more videos for all you all. And I'll just get started with a story of how we met, where Marek and I met 3 years ago, and he sent me an email saying my maps aren't very good because Marek's maps are absolutely beautiful. And he asked if he could get a job making maps. And I told him no, but then we started talking. We became very good friends. And over time, I gave him more responsibilities to manage my email, manage the business side. And now he works for me full time.
Yep. Yeah, it was a long process, but well worth it. It it's really hard, of course, because I have so many friends who work at some grocery store or, a bank or whatever. And it's just this soul crushing job of paperwork or dealing with customers who are a pain in the butt. But, working with Rudyard, it's just the two of us, we just text and email. If anything, if one of us is sick, it's just like, hey, I can't work today. And that's it. This is shaping up to be a pretty good career so far. So, I really lucked out in a lot of ways. It was funny because I saw, of course, I was on my phone and I saw a meme, and the meme was like, it wasn't actually a meme, it was a post, right? But the post said, just a reminder to all the Gen Z people, there's no job where you work from home with no college degree and no qualifications for, $50K a year. And I'm like, that's literally my job.
Yeah, it's funny because the way the WhatifAltHist staff works, for some backtracking, is Marek works full time for me, does a lot of the back end stuff. We've got an editor who combs through the videos and cuts them up. If the videos are bad production, it's entirely my fault. But on top of that, we used to have a researcher, Seamus, who works for the Hoover Institute, but he was working a couple other jobs, and he's still part of our circle, but he was too busy. But I try to follow my dad's advice, where my dad says looking for college degrees is just an abdication of responsibility. And I can immediately tell if someone's qualified for a position by talking to them for 15 minutes. And neither Marek nor I have college degrees. And I know that Marek has the intelligence and the skills. And it's crazy that the society we look at, it's a society where you look for, because any person can tell if someone in their industry is qualified very quickly in most occupations. But everything is done through some BS procedure now.
Well, for risk management. Hey, Marek, I just want to say hi. Not only am I a fan, of course, of WhatifAltHist and Rudyard, this means by extension, I'm a fan of Marek because of the work you do, et cetera. And not only do you do all of the sort of the back of the house operational stuff, but you also are involved in some of the thoughts put into these videos and the topics and things like that. So I want to say thank you. What you guys do is incredibly interesting. I became a fan and I had a similar experience. I reached out to Rudyard, said, hello. I run a speaker series and a think tank, and I think what you're saying is really valuable, and some other folks, some more mainstream people need to hear it, right? So that's how we got connected. And your experience is particularly resonates for me. I mean, you talk about education. I know that's one of your areas of interest. Maybe we can talk about that maybe towards the end of this. But your thoughts on education reform, improving education in the world? Because I've been the head of recruiting. I've been an executive recruiter. I've hired thousands and thousands of people, and you can usually tell fairly quickly whether the person's qualified or not. The degree doesn't really necessarily mean anything other than the person could put off justification, an immediate gratification. Yeah, they can do that. They have pretty good memory, et cetera. But theoretically, getting a degree gets you in the door, and it's now your time to learn. You haven't learned crap, right?
Right.
And real quick, I had a 72-year-old secretary when I first got out of college, and she hated me with a passion, right? So I get out of school, I got this managerial job. I've got this executive assistant, we called them secretaries back in the day. And until I would run the sweeper and until I would vacuum, she hated me. I'm a stupid college boy. What the hell do you know, right? She's been with the company almost 50 years, right? And she literally hated me with the passion. So I started running the sweeper at night, and she softened up, and we became friends, et cetera. And she stopped trying to sabotage me, right? But her point was well taken. I mean, you get out of undergraduate school with a management degree. It's kind of interesting. What have you done? You're going to manage people. You don't know how to do crap, right? So now I get to manage other people. Nah. So I'm in violent agreement with you on that. One of the things I think that Rudyard wanted to do with this is get people to know you a little bit better, maybe some of your background, some of your interests, et cetera, and especially some of your areas of interest, your areas of expertise.
Yeah, I mean, just to briefly go over my background, I'm from Lynn, Massachusetts, originally. I came from newly Christian family. My parents had basically no background of religion and then just decided they were going to start going to church. And then I am the second of seven. So I've been, and my mom ran a daycare. So I've been taking care of kids basically my whole life. I was homeschooled for most of my life. Fifth grade, I went to school, and high school, I was in public school. But beyond that, I was homeschooled, and I use the term homeschooled very loosely. The benefits to being homeschooled was I could kind of look into whatever I wanted, and we had this old, it was like a 1995, 1998, like encyclopedia, right? And I would just flip through it and read. I could read from a pretty young age. And I found the section on the two world wars, and I would just read through that because I thought it was really cool. And that's kind of where my interest in history got started. After I had graduated high school, I had a fight with my mom because it was a really rough time for my family at that point. And I moved with my grandparents in New Hampshire. I lived there for about 10 months. Funny enough, before I got with Rudyard, I don't think I've actually held a job for over a year, just due to whatever circumstances would come up. Working with Rudyard is the first time I've actually been, with a company
for 2 years, right?
Yeah, just over 2 years now. And so, yeah, I moved up to New Hampshire with my grandparents, and then I moved back to Lynn with an uncle of mine. He died while I was living with him, so I moved back in with my parents temporarily, and now I've moved to Malden, where I live with my girlfriend. So I met Rudyard while I was living with my uncle, because that's when I shot him the email. And he and I have, progressed our relationship since then. That was in what, 2020? 2020? Yeah, 2020.
Yeah, it was February of 2020.
Yep. Yeah. And right, he and I would shoot emails back and forth for a while, and then we moved to Discord and text and stuff. And so I've been working with him ever since. And it's worked out really good. As anybody who's watched his recent videos knows, we go on trips to wherever in the world. So it's been a good time. And like I said, I enjoyed not having to deal with a mile of bureaucracy between me and the person who pays me. So
yeah.
Yeah, so that's a bit about what I was doing prior.
Marek is the only person I've ever met, besides myself, who can draw any country in any year of history.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really funny, of course, because Rudyard and I draw very different maps when you look at it, because my thing is...
I'm going to put up both of our maps during this part of the video.
Yeah, that works. But Rudyard and I draw very different maps. Rudyard draws a lot of cultural and anthropological stuff on his maps, right? The borders are all linguistic groups and religious areas and things like that. And I'm a big person on borders, right? I'm big on getting the border changes, year by year across the globe, and particularly in Europe. And so, right, like I put a lot of, what did Rudyard say? You were like, Rudyard will make maps because he wants to cover a topic, and I make maps because I think it's an art form, and so it's like, Rudyard's like, yeah, this will be cool, and I want to get this done. And I'm like painstakingly researching 5 different Wikipedia articles and news tabs to see if I can figure out, the border of, the Kievan Rus in, 970 or whatever.
Yeah, it's funny at times where, well, we share some experiences because we're both into map making,
Yeah.
but on my maps, like my father likes to say, I am the opposite of OCD, and
It's not wrong.
yeah, and that's why I hire Marek, because just I don't give a fuck about details. And I care that the borders give some degree of understanding of what was going on. So, for example, if it's the year 1700, when Germany was split into 500 states, I'll just randomly draw a bunch of states because no one really cares. And Marek will actually go down. Or we drew maps of the World War II era, and I had a rough outline for the Burma-Assam border between the Japanese and British empires. And Marek said, "You got the river pattern slightly wrong." And I'm like, "You think I care?"
Right.
And by the way, do you think the observer knows the difference? Probably not. So,
Well, right. And
there is a subset of fans that do.
right. It's funny because I'd say probably, 3/4 of the fan base like will go along with it and doesn't care, right? But then there's a quarter of the fan base who will literally, do what I did and email us and be like,
A lot of
well, this specific line right here is off by like 5.
So that should be an
5
Easter egg
yards.
contest. You should have a contest to see who can figure out, what the problem is.
Yeah,
and you get a
That
star.
would get overwhelming so quickly.
funny that people's external, I deal with a lot of influencers, and people's external personalities are often the opposite of what they are. And people often comment, Rudyard's autistic, which the ironic thing is, I'm kind of like, if you know me as a person, I am extremely not. I'm not making this a brag. I'm just horrible at details. I'm constantly like doing something. I don't know how to better describe it.
Right.
I think we're a lot like that way, in that I care about big picture stuff, et cetera. I don't care about details too much. I care about the essence of things. There are a few things I want to get right that need to be right, but it's too consuming to get everything exactly right all the time.
Well, it's really interesting, of course, because, I care a lot more for details than Rudyard does, but then, I'll be at the apartment with my girlfriend and she cares more for details than I do, and so it's weird because, of course, when I'm with Rudyard, I'm the detail oriented person, and then I'm with my girlfriend and now she's the detail, right? And so there's a chain of like, OCD basically, where people get more and more frustrated about literal, smaller things, as things go by, right? And that's part of how you get a good sort of like command structure, right? Is you delegate smaller details to people who are better at focusing on those things,
And that's a good life lesson, which is, I was told for a long time to work on my weaknesses. You got to fix this, you got to shore this up, as opposed to play to your strengths and then delegate the rest. Be really, no one pays you to be average.
Right.
You need to be really, really average at a whole bunch of stuff.
This leads to our comments of the educational system, because neither Marek and I I don't think it's unrealistic to say we're both fairly intelligent, but neither of us got good grades in school. And I was constantly bashed. It's funny that I didn't think I was that smart before I left high school, because no one really no one really said it. I didn't get good grades in school. And then I left high school and everyone said, "Oh my God, I love your show. You do great research." And it was a big adjustment for me, because it was just like a complete 360. And I'm kind of resentful that the educational system, it constantly got me on stuff that didn't matter, where like the math or doing grammar properly or doing exact proofreading correctly, it's never really affected my life. Maximizing my skill set has. And also what I found is that the skills that weren't taught in school have ended up becoming the most important, where I do a lot of networking and socializing and stuff for my job, and being able to just be a good social person and be respectful, be charming, that's something you'll never get taught in school. Being able to take risks and be able to handle stress or think out of the box, those are things that are actively pushed against for school. And I look at so many people our generation, or Marek's in my generation, they're incapable of doing anything because their parents have split them off between, first of all, I'm going to control every second of your life and you'll constantly be at violin recital, and like
Soccer practice.
lacrosse, or their parents give them absolutely no guidance. And like, I don't pretend to have perfect parents. They have a lot of problems in their own way. But my mom was obsessed with politeness. And so if I did something impolite, she'd get really angry at me. And my dad told me that the main thing that mattered in life was honor. And so I'll run into these other kids and I'll look at how they act and I think, wait, your parents didn't do anything. They just like shoved you off to school, and then you watched TV when you came home.
You were babysat in different situations throughout the day because they didn't have to. I went to 11 schools by the time I got to the 10th grade. I got to go to all 3 years of high school at the same school, which was great. That forced me to be an observer of the education system and of teachers and kids and whatever, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes I was in a poor rural area of all whites, or a Hispanic neighborhood, or Black neighborhood, or mixed, right? So I got to see all of those military ones. I got to see all of those, right? And there were some common themes. The bullying happened everywhere. There were smart kids and there were bad kids. Smart kids and dumb kids, and mean and nice. But the school system did exactly what you're saying, which is it focused on things that you probably weren't going to use the rest of your life, right? That you might not need. They didn't do a good job of having a path for some people who had skills this way versus that way. There's not a lot of tailoring, if you will, right? A lot of some people don't want to go get a 4-year college white collar job or whatever. We killed our trade schools in America. We don't have those really anymore, right? Almost no one is going to solve for the area under a curve. No one's going to look, solve for X in their job. Therefore, algebra, calculus. Do I need those? And do I need to feel bad about myself because I can't do those? And that's really what came out of it. At the same time, in this generation, almost every parent in the schools has tried to tell little Johnny and little Susie that they're special, and that they're unique, and that they can change the world. So we set up these incredibly high expectations for you, right? Mm-hmm. We don't really apply much discipline or direction, et cetera, right? Social media really raises you. It's really, if parents think they're raising their kids, they're crazy. They're not raising anybody, right? It's their peers in social media that have 92% of the influence on anybody growing up today. And these are all things that you've observed, Marek, et cetera. You lived through a lot of them, et cetera, right? Some of you guys had to deal with COVID, right? Which was a unique experience, which I think really was a huge hardship for people that we're going to feel the echoes of for a generation. But from your take, what were the biggest things that you think need to be done to improve education, things that you would like to have seen when you were in school, and what's sort of the prescription? If you could fix a few things, if you could be king for a day, and redraw the map.
Yeah, might take a little more than a day. This is a very deeply flawed system. But so the first thing is, of course, the parents, which you can't really fix. There's not much that you can do about that. But a lot of people don't stop to realize, that the struggles that you had when you were in high school, right, and the struggles that your kids have when they're in high school are so vastly different from each other that how can you, as a parent, right, who's a boomer or Gen X, help your millennial or Gen Z child through their, middle school and high school experience when it is just a completely different world from what you're used to, right? And I'm not critiquing parents, right? I'm not like mad at them, like, well, how could you, right? It's just,
it's I'm the world in which we live in, and we can't be judgmental about that, right? This is how it is.
No, right. But that is the reality of the situation, is parents are completely unequipped to deal with, the world. Like my mom at some point, I don't know, I think I was mouthing off to her or whatever, but she was like, at some point people had respect for older people and blah, blah, blah. I was like, yeah, because you used to like die at a massive rate. If you lived to 60, it was an incredible feat, right? And the world changed so little. If I was born in, 990 and lived to, 1020, the world had changed so little in that time frame that a 60-year-old knew a lot about how the world worked. Now, a 60-year-old has no idea what's going on for Gen Z because the world has changed so much in that same, time span. So the first thing is just sort of everybody kind of coming to the understanding that things are changing really quick, and it's very difficult for anybody to get a grasp on that, right? And for the parents to sort of be forgiving to teachers, especially, when they try to deal with this situation, because it's very different from whatever the parents think that this is supposed to be. But in terms of actual like structural changes, just a few things, right? Gym should just go away. People don't play outside like they used to. And I think that a lot of older people would be like, well, they should be ready to play outside. I don't think gym gets you ready to play outside. I don't actually think it does anything particularly useful for people. I know it's supposed to encourage physical fitness. I don't think it does that. I don't think it grasps kids in any way. I think that
calms down like overly energetic dudes.
Right. I think the best option that you could have for a high school is a self-defense class. I think it would be much better served to teach high school kids, right? If you live in a red state, how to deal with firearms, how to do jujitsu, how to do, basic self-defense stuff, right? I think that would be much better served for high school students than.
So I'm not sure how to react to that. So I did wrestling, boxing, and judo and Muay Thai as a kid before mixed martial arts existed.
Right.
Because I moved around so much, I got my ass kicked a lot. Right. And I would walk into a town or whatever, into a dojo and say, hey, I need to learn to protect myself. I'm getting my butt handed to me. Right. And then they would say, well, we're going to go through some sort of traditional art and you're going to practice, et cetera, against nobody, against thin air. And I would say, well, I need to fight somebody. I want to go full speed. And they said, well, once you've been here a year or two and you've had 5 belts, we'll let you hit somebody. And I go, no, I want to fight your instructor. And I'd challenge the instructor. When the time I was 15 on, I just, wherever I went, and then, but a boxing gym would let you get into the ring right then. I didn't care. Right. Okay. So I had this advantage, even though I was smaller, because I knew all that stuff and nobody else did. Now, giant people are doing MMA. This is horrible.
Yeah.
This is really bad.
Yeah.
When a 250-pound guy can do all the same stuff that I could do, I don't know. So, and then my issue with that is it does kind of tend to promote. It's great. I mean, if you're going to do any self-defense, it needs to be MMA. It needs to be jiu-jitsu, boxing, that, because the traditional stuff just doesn't work.
Right.
Doesn't. Sorry.
Right.
But that being true, does it promote fighting? And if you fight today, your life is over in school.
Well,
if you get in a fight.
Right. But that's kind of the problem. That's one of the other issues with the education system, right? Is like my dad would always say in 1970, 1980, when you were in school, right, middle school or whatever, junior high, if kids had a problem, they'd go and they'd punch each other, and eventually one of them would get knocked out or get a bloody nose or whatever. And that would be it. And everybody would go home and they'd move on after that, right? And now the parents who grew up in that world are like, well, I don't want that happening to my kid. And so, right, if you fight each other, it's now problematic. But if you can, the way I like to say it is, you can't usually stop people from doing something bad, but you can at least put restrictions on how that works. So if you make a place, right, if you teach boxing, if you teach jujitsu, if you teach kids how to fight, they can do it in a format that is not as dangerous for them.
Yes, that's
right?
harmful. Yeah. And I was never as nice in my life as when I was boxing full time.
No, right. And that's
I got it all out.
If two kids have a problem, it's easier to it's better to have the gym teacher there to oversee this fight go on, right? Just put on the gloves
and get out the natural
aggression,
out the ring real quick, especially males have. Yeah. Okay.
And that's not necessarily what I'm saying should happen, but again, I think that sort of a system would be better served than whatever it is that's going on now. So that's, and the other thing is they take no account for weight class, right? They divvy everything up by weight class in professional things. In gym, they don't divvy you up by anything. It's just everybody's doing the same thing. And of course, these kids are grossly unequipped to do most of the things they're being asked to do. So I replaced gym. Another thing I would do is mathematics. You need to know how to add, subtract, multiply, divide. Need to know how to deal with decimals, and you need to know probably how to deal with fractions. After that point, math should be an elective. It should not be mandatory. I've never once used algebra in my life. I've never used calculus in my life. Unless you are going into a field, and if you're going into a field that requires calculus, you probably know well in advance.
And you need to be really good at it too. You don't need to get a B.
No, right, exactly. You need to do really good. And again, I'm not saying that you should take that opportunity away from those people, but if they know they're moving in that direction, if you're that good with numbers, you take the elective, you do the calculus,
because getting it almost right at NASA on the calculation isn't going to work.
Right, exactly. So when you need to do that level of math, you need to be really good. And people who are really good should have the opportunity to go out and do it. And people like myself who haven't calculated an angle since I graduated, don't need to deal with that. I just don't see a point, right? And everybody's like, well, it's problem solving. And I'm like, you can give way better scenarios for problem solving. There are way better things that you can be using to teach problem solving in schools, much more realistic situations.
The schools,
The other thing,
So this is a notion of specialization, if you will, and having options, customization of
Right.
education, right? Sort of a Montessori, almost homeschool type approach, which is what do you want to study? We're going to hold you a high standard of that, right? You're not going to just be able to screw off, but you're going to focus on what you care about most, and therefore you'll do better. Now, broad understanding of things is important too. We want a citizenry that has a broad understanding, right? So I almost argue there's a curriculum for these are the basic things everyone should know, whether they go to college or not, right? Including how to fill out a checkbook, balance your checkbook, or whatever, practical things. But yeah, angles, you probably need to understand what a 90-degree angle is, and a couple things like that. But do you need to be an expert at geometry? Maybe not.
Right. No, absolutely.
So it'd be nice if there was a curricula that was created, that a handbook.
Well, right. And that's the thing, is it'd be nice to have that, right? And if I had the ability, I'd get a team of people together to deal with that issue. But right, I don't, nobody's coming up with it right now. And even if you could come up with it right now, of course, there'd be a mile and a half of bureaucracy to get through before you could even implement anything. But
for self-educated, you guys are both self-educated.
Yes. Yeah.
So what should the self-educated person teach themselves?
Oh, whatever interests you, whatever calls to you, whatever really seems like something that you're particularly suited for. If you've got really good hand-eye coordination, play video games. You can make money playing video games if you're really good at it. I don't believe in rounding yourself out. Not that you shouldn't, but just I don't think that you need to. I think you, like you said earlier, right? You need to specialize. You need to find one thing that you're really good at and get really, really good at that thing. Whatever it is that you're suited for, you need to double down on that thing. When your grandparents ask you what you want for Christmas or your birthday, you ask them for a present that suits your needs, right? You get books on this topic, you get whatever it is that will engage you for this thing, right? If you're self-educated, whatever it is that you're going to focus on, because a lot of people have attention issues, especially in this world, you need to find something you're going to be able to focus on for long periods of time. And so whatever that thing is, that's what you should get for yourself if you're trying to be self-educated.
I think there's a fundamental motivation problem that the educational system has no concept of how actual human nature works. And so what ends up happening is the reason we focus so much on STEM that doesn't matter is that this is a theme I'll constantly circle back to, and it's one of my biggest discoveries I've recently made philosophically, is modern structures view everything bureaucratically and mechanistically. And what the decision that was made in the middle of the 20th century was, we need more people in STEM. Let's make everyone take STEM classes so that we produce more engineers. However, what ended up happening was that it actually disincentivized people from joining STEM, which we've seen recently in that the amount of inventions collapsed precipitously over the last century. If you look at the engineers in America, most of them are Asians. We import them. And we structured it in a manner so that people didn't want to go into STEM because it was boring and it was just a class to pass to get to college. And you see this in history as well, where we don't have any concept that you need to teach history for a certain purpose. So what ends up happening, and because we have no cultural unity, and what the left has explicitly done is try to divide stories and concepts and ideas of the world. This is something we literally have records of leftist thinkers doing to destroy any sense of coherent thought that could be used against the left. And so history was turned from something that most young men loved to think about and was key to national identities to something that people didn't understand because it was cut up into a series of discrete events with no meaning that you would study and regurgitate for a test.
Right. Well, and what I would do to sort of combat that, because that is exactly what's going on. But what I think would be a good system to sort of counter that is, I think there needs to be a lot more coordination between schools and businesses. I think that would help a lot. What I would like to see is Microsoft wants to open up a facility in a city. Okay. And they communicate with all the high schools in the area saying, we're going to need X number of people to fill these positions when once the facility is opened up. The the school will then, right, they're going to need X number of software programmers, right? So we're going to open up a course to do software programming for this school because we know for a fact that Microsoft is going to open up a facility here, right? And then once you graduate from this class, right, with whatever the prerequisite grade is, we'll get you a job interview for this company that we know is going to need jobs here, right? So now it's like you're going to take this software, right? Because I took a programming class and I forgot everything in it because it didn't mean anything to me once I left school, right?
So it's funny, by the way, they call that adult learning characteristics. And when I worked for Accenture, I designed training and we focused on adult learner characteristics. They are the same characteristics of a young child. Does it matter to me? Will I use it, etc.?
Right.
They make it interesting to me.
Right.
I mean, why is that adult? It drove me crazy that we called it adult learning characteristics, right?
Yeah.
No. And so your point is great.
Well, and Rudyard has mentioned this in his videos, right? But the current format of understanding for humanity is that when you walk into the world, you are a blank piece of paper. And if we write on you, we can turn you into whatever we want, right? And that's just objectively false. You come with a preset amount of genetic code that predetermines not all, but many of your behavioral patterns and the way you view life, right? And there's no account for that, right? So when you're an adult, it's like, well, clearly this person has interests and a life and, you know, time constraints and stuff, but there's no sense of that when, you know, you're 6, 7, 8, you know. But that's another thing that I would do, right, to help out teachers in especially high school is give them the same sort of format as a college, where as a teacher, I decide this 9 to 5 thing is nonsensical at this point, right? In 1950, in 1960, probably up to about 1980, it made sense to do the 9 to 5 thing because that's what most people working was a 9 to 5 thing. Now there's jobs all over the place at various different times, and it doesn't make sense for people to believe that you have to wake up at 6 a.m. to go to get breakfast at the school and then work, you know, and then you're there and
Especially
you don't
not when young
3 or
people
5, right?
They learn better at 10 or noon onward, right?
Right. The teachers should be able to say, look, I'm going to set the class. The class is going to be at this time. And then I, as a student, can say, okay, right, you look through the list. When is this? You know, maybe a nighttime class works for me, right? Especially, like I said, especially in high school. In elementary school, I think doing the 9 to 5 thing is best because, right, that's when a lot of people, not all, but a lot of people are working. It's just easier to have the kids there at that time. But the high schools, the teacher should have a lot more ability to move around, right? If the teacher wants to teach a class at 6 p.m. and I, as a student, can arrive for that, right? Or do it online, because again, being online is a huge game changer for schooling now.
Yeah.
I should have that option. You know, that should be available.
Two things I want
to. The only game changer that makes your program work is the remote learning,
right?
Because you're not going to get a teacher to take a class to do it at 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening. The teachers have a lot of say, and you can't get enough teachers. And so there is a teacher.
No, right. But if you change the structure of things to be more friendly to the worker, to the teacher, you'd probably get a lot more interest in that field, right? Because even though they have a union and everything, it's not, schools are the least friendly to teachers of everybody in that process, right? The teachers are getting most of the
right. If they have to show up at 8 in the evening or 5 in the morning, they want to work 9 to 5 if they have to show up. But if they can work from home, then...
No, right. Well, but again, I think that you would look at that, right? I would look at that and say college professors, maybe they don't set a course for 8 in the evening usually, right? But there's a bit of range where college professors will say, I'm going to set this class for early in the morning or later on in the afternoon. And they kind of have the decision for when do I want to do the class.
And the marketplace decides whether it fills up or not.
Right, exactly, right. And so I think having that model, like I said, especially for high school, for middle school and elementary school, I don't think that that's a huge step that needs to be taken. But for high school especially, I think letting the teachers pick when they're going to put a class out and letting the market decide who's going to show up would be a really good move.
I want to circle back to the point Marek made earlier, where first of all, the hours we do school are insane.
Yeah.
The thing is, for middle school, I woke up at 5:30 a.m. and my school started at 7:20. I grew up in the countryside where it was a big school district. So it was a half an hour, 40-minute bus ride to the middle. And the thing is, there's no good reason to put school that early except for parents to basically babysitting the kids. And that doesn't even work because the kids still come home when the parents are still working. And the other thing I think is that a system that would work very well educationally is an apprentice system where that teaches people because they've got an incentive to learn. And so if you apprentice to your future occupation, it's partially the older guy has got a younger person to do random crap for them and they establish a relationship, but also it means that learning happens in a personalized manner for an actual gain. And you
Right.
see that in a lot of like
And acquired knowledge can be passed on to other people.
Yeah.
But what you're both talking about here, a couple of things is one is you're shortening the length of the educational career
Yes.
and moving people into the workplace and into their adulthood faster.
Yes.
Americans get out at 18, 19 from high school. You go to England, it's 16. And you start specializing at 16 into what you're going to go to. You take your A levels, your O levels, and you decide whether you're going to go to university, if you're not going to go to university, et cetera. We prolong childhood this way, right? And we prolong, and we require you to get a 4-year degree, for example, to become a doctor. You do not have to get a 4-year generic degree to become a doctor in England. They start specializing. They get out of school earlier because of this, right?
Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons people don't want to become a doctor in America is I got to go through, I get out of high school at 18, 19, I do 4 years of college. Then I start going into med school, et cetera. I'm 30 something years old before I get out with all that debt, right?
Yeah.
So we are prolonging childhood and we're keeping people from going by we're not putting them in an apprenticeship program. We're not letting them specialize. We're making them take courses they don't want to take, et cetera, right? So therefore, they don't end up getting life experience. So we end up with people who are adolescents longer.
Yeah. And the fundamental reality is that you don't need that much school. I learned WhatifAltHist. I learned how to write research, do business management, edit the videos, and the YouTube algorithm all by myself over a period of several years. Marek had no background in it.
In high school, basically.
Yeah, Marek had no background in what he does, but he's a smart dude. He had interest in it. And so I taught him how to do all the stuff. And that's really, that stuff works. And I like to say the problem with modernity is we combine the autistic masculine with the hysterical feminine. And I know you two have heard me say that a couple times. And our education system combines this autistic bureaucracy that doesn't really make sense with also this kind of like Karen-y feminine side to it, where it prolongs childhood, it prevents responsibility, it prevents people growing as individuals. And then you churn out kids that have no agency. And that was definitely part of the plan for constructing the education system, where it's based off the Prussian model, which exists to turn serfs into good factory workers and good soldiers. And a lot of the inventors of the modern education system, they said, we're not doing this we have literal quotes, we're not doing this to create scholars or philosophers or artists or generals. We're doing this to make people who can toil readily.
Right. Well, and again, it was to toil in a system that no longer exists, you know, but when you have an elite, a social and political elite that has no comprehension of what has gone on since they left that field, they see no reason to change it, right? And why bother if there's not a mass of people lobbying to reform education? Then why should we make any moves? Because then it has to be this big debate. And we have to throw money around it. It's more of a headache for me as a politician, you know, to deal with it than it would be to just kind of ignore it and deal with whatever else shows up on my desk.
So you're saying if you were McDonald's and you didn't have to change, right? You would keep selling the same burgers forever and ever and ever, right?
Right.
Because the customer has no choice in this. And there's no outward pressure, right?
That is,
we like it. We like our hamburgers. We like where our locations are. We like our hours or whatever. We're going to keep that.
That is the primary downfall of communism, right? Is that it doesn't matter what people want. You know, the factory is going to put out 5,000 tractors because the government said so. And it doesn't matter what's done with those tractors. You know, if they all rot away in storage rooms, it doesn't matter, you know?
And a fundamental problem with that is that we have a society, our leadership class were designed by a system to make factory workers. And it's why our society does so much dumb stuff, because we categorize everything. And you wonder why society makes decisions like shipping our factories to China, importing millions of immigrants while local Americans can't get by, like having a suicidal religion. And the fundamental reason is that no one is told to go above and beyond for something they actually believe in. Our social educational system is designed to do your job, sit down, go to class, go home. But
Do not walk the boat.
if we had a more apprentice-based educational system, or a system, I would love to see an education system. This is partially negative feminization. Imagine if people got together in groups that they formed naturally and they competed against each other to do projects. Or one of my friends, we're talking about making a video game to teach philosophic concepts and strategies, and then you have kids play the video game, and imagine through competing over the video game, you learn lessons, but you also have to cooperate with your teammates. You could even, like, people talk about like group exercises or problem solving. Imagine if you played giant games of capture the flag against each other. That teaches coordination, it teaches risk taking, it teaches groups, and that's stuff that matters much more for work. But now, like, you see this with the government all the time, our leadership class is horrible because we don't have any ability to train people to operate outside of organizations where they're not being bossed around by someone.
Right. Well, and this is part of the, another thing that plays into that problem is that since 1950, there's been sort of this crystallization of certain things not working together and being in opposition, right? In the minds of the average person, religion and science are polar opposites and can no way work together or be reconcilable, right? You're either on one side of this argument or you're on the other, right? I think for a lot of people, right, the schooling and video games are kind of the same thing, right? You can't use video games to actually teach people things, unless it's carefully curated to be in an educational environment. But if you've ever played a first-person shooter game, or like my buddy plays them, and the level of coordination that people will go through in video games is insane. They will literally work like a military unit in this video game, to go complete whatever the objective is, right? Yeah, and there is no level of coordination in school at all. There's no incentive to work with people or to coordinate ever. There's no reason to work with people, even when you're explicitly told to do exactly that. Because the fact of the matter is, once you're in a group of 5 people, I think I literally said this at one point, we were put into a group project, right? And there was like 5 of us. And I was like, okay, who's actually going to get things done? Because I'm not. Like, I have no investment in this at all, right?
Well,
and
I was in
like
groups
2 of
with
the
you
kids
on
were like,
projects.
I kind of knew them as the smart kids in the class. I was like, I'll literally give you guys $20 if I don't have to participate in this. And they were like,
happened in the grad school level for me. I went through Moot Corp, where you start a business in graduate school, right? And you got a couple of ideas, you get people together, etc. Some of it, I and one other guy were entrepreneurial, and we were dedicated. The other 3 guys couldn't give a rat's butt, and they did nothing, whatever. One was going to go get his big job back in Germany with Siemens, and this was just a class for him, right?
He was working at Siemens.
Yeah, he ended up working for Siemens. I ended up with this. I should have listened to the one.
I've worked with them too, but continue.
What's that?
I've worked with them too.
Okay. I should have listened to the one entrepreneur other guy and should have ignored the others. But I was trying to be, collaborative and work with everybody, etc. And I ended up listening to I'm the one other guy. We're the only 2 that ever became entrepreneurs and did anything, right? In terms of starting a business. These guys were very successful. That's fine. Let me tell you, someone who's owned a business, has hired people, has run businesses, we're all looking for that person who's somewhat entrepreneurial. Yeah. They take ownership. They're like you, Marek. They're somebody who enjoys what they do. They're invested in it. They work to fix the problem, make the business better, do a great job because they love it and care about it, etc. And don't have to be told every minute what to do, like a robot.
Well, the thing about being entrepreneurial, and Rudyard and I had a discussion with some friends where we kind of talked about this, right? But the 1,000 years ago, if you were a medieval peasant, the opportunities available to you were basically nothing, right? You were born, your dad had a farm. He'd show you how to work that farm. At some point, you'd get married, you'd have 12 kids, and you'd have that farm. So there was a level of stability in your life, right? You'd always have this farm, right? Assuming there wasn't any plague or disease outbreak, But for the most part, right, assuming all went according to plan, you'd have this farm. You'd never have anything else. That was it. You're getting this plot of land and nothing else for the rest of your life. So you have this security, but you have no opportunity, right? Now it is the inverse, right? You are guaranteed nothing. Once you graduate high school and you're on your own, no one offers you anything. You've got to sell yourself, right? And you have these massive impersonal bureaucracies, okay? And the bureaucracies, the trade-off, right, is supposed to be, it is not, but what it's supposed to be is, I work in this bureaucracy that is soul crushing, right? McDonald's or, Stop and Shop, wherever it is, right? I work in the place that is soul crushing, that gives me nothing, that feeds me as an individual in no way and gives me no sense of meaning, right? But I'll be able to, over time, work up this sort of chain and maybe move into management or get experience that I can use in another job where I can work up that, right? And so the opportunity to get a higher salary, right, to get a more comfortable home, to get a better car is there, right? And so having this impersonal bureaucracy that I have to work towards, the trade-off for this soul-crushing work that I do is the opportunity to move up and get more money and therefore have more opportunities for myself in the future. Unfortunately, that is not the case, right? Because especially in areas with college degrees, right, is these boomers show up, right? And the boomers are told, well, you need to move into all these expanding factory workers and blah, 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 and go, move into these management places. And so they do, right? And they're there. And most of the boomers who moved into these management level positions are still there, right? Or were still there up until COVID. And so they're telling everybody else, well, this is what I learned is I have to move into these, but they're literally holding these positions, which have not really grown all that much since probably 1970, 1980. And more people are coming up trying to get these management jobs that are basically all filled out already. And so there's really no opportunity in this field at this time. So the world does not prepare you to be an entrepreneur. It tells you if you work with the system, right? There's sort of this propagandist idea in America that everybody should have an entrepreneurial spirit, but we do nothing to encourage that. There's no system that actually wants you to be an entrepreneur because they want you to stay within the system, right, and benefit this system. They want you to benefit the corporation.
To me helping you start a new business, and you're supposed to help me with mine.
Right. I have a business. You should come and help me with my business. And now all these businesses are massive conglomerates for the most part. And they offer very little opportunities, right? As opposed to, like I said, right, in 1950, 1960, these were still sort of expanding industries a lot of times. Yeah. And so there was a lot of opportunity, right? The primary area that is expanding now is tech, right? Tech still has a lot of opportunity. Not anymore. Nowhere else. Right. Exactly. Even that's slowing down.
Yeah. I'm reading this interesting book. It's called The Economics of Discontent, and it goes through how the economics allow us to have a major crisis. And one of the interesting points it makes is that social mobility for people born in 1980 was half of that for people born in 1940. And then I imagine what's it like for people like Marek or me, who were born at the start of the new millennium. Do we have social mobility a quarter of what the boomers had?
Right. Right. It might even.
So I don't know. It's interesting. I will tell you that there are older people, 50s, 60s, whatever, who feel discriminated against because businesses tell them, no, we want a younger and cheaper version of you.
Right.
And you need to go away now. And it doesn't seem to be even considered uncool to be ageist. Yeah. We want a young, hip, cool kid in this, and that's okay. The baby, the inverted triangle of having a lot of older people and fewer people at the bottom is a problem. The only thing that would be worse, though, is if there were a lot of younger people trying to get into those jobs. Yeah. Imagine if that pyramid was shaped differently. Right. Then if you had tens of thousands of young people or millions more young people trying to get those jobs as these people slowly age out, that would be even more difficult.
This is the problem with immigration and globalization and all that, where no one thought we're screwing over all of the Americans to benefit a group that dislikes us. And the thing is, when we move factories to China, people must have realized that we were industrializing the country that had the potential to be our greatest rival. And we were at war with them a couple of decades before. And
Kissinger said that. Kissinger did said that. He said our biggest risk is that the Chinese, and he and Nixon were responsible for opening up the relationship with China. Yeah. He said, our biggest concern is that they become capitalists like we are in some way, some form or fashion, and that unleashes this 1 point whatever billion workers, et cetera, with their drive and industriousness, et cetera.
Yeah.
And that was seen, but very much like a crack addiction, any corporation here that was getting evaluated on a quarterly basis could say, hey, I just cut my cost by 3% by
Yeah.
sending this work over here.
Well, so
And-
this is something that I've always just found sort of insane about a lot of people is, people will talk about corporations and the terrible things that they do to, the cows that they slaughter and package, right? And the awful things that go on there, how as people will say, corporations will queer bait, right? The month of June comes on and they got to slap a rainbow flag on literally everything they do. And then June goes away and all those rainbow flags are gone, right? And really all that corporations do, or all they're trying to do, is increase profits. That is their whole goal. They are completely amoral entities beyond that point.
Indifferent. I mean, theoretically,
Right.
you're providing a service or a good that has value for the other person, so they'll pay you.
Right, exactly. And so the thing is, you cannot, and people have all these weird moral expectations for corporations. How can they do this? Why won't they do this? They're not
They're not
hiring
built
these
to do that. They're not your saint. They're not your brother.
Right.
They're not your
Until
mother.
there is a profit motive to do something or not do something, they are going to do whatever they believe is the cheapest way of approaching this thing, right? And people will be like, well, there's cheaper ways to do this. And I'm like, yeah, but then they'd have to switch all the machinery over to that cheaper format, right? And that's probably pretty expensive. And there's just this general inertia of having a large
If it's not worth
bureaucracy.
it to the buyer, then they're not going to do it. But
It's
if
right.
virtue signaling, if woke is important to people, corporations will play
They
to
will
that.
feed into that, right?
If big portion sizes are important to the buyer, you're going to get big happy meals,
Right.
right?
Right.
Whatever you
Exactly.
want, we're going to give it to you, right?
Right.
And we're probably even going to push the envelope a little bit on whether it's safe for you or it's actually ethical to do it or not.
Right.
As
Because
long as you
again,
buy
that's
it
not,
and it's not against the law directly, we're going to do
right.
it.
Right. Because again, as long as I'm making the money. And so, right, unless you can have the social cohesion as a group to boycott them into meeting your demands, so to speak, the corporations are only ever going to do what is profitable for them. And the fact of the matter is, I don't feel any sort of way about that, right? Some people are really disgusted by that concept. And I'm like, it's not a huge deal. That's just how corporations work, right? If you want them to do the right thing, you have to force them to do the right thing, And so it's weird to me that people have these moral standards for large. I think that is one of the things that has happened in the post-World War II era. And I've studied a lot about the impact of the Second World War on modern history. But one of the big things that has come out of World War II is after everybody watched, particularly the Nazis, butcher millions of innocent people, there were suddenly moral standards for how institutions were supposed to behave, right? Which didn't really exist beforehand. And there was lots of reasons for that, right? In 1700, most people did not have any stake in what the state did, right? The government of France or England or whatever, right? The average person didn't really have any say in how that worked. So it didn't really matter if we got into a war or what these corporations were doing or these trading companies or whatnot, because it doesn't really mean anything to me. I have no say over it anyways, right? By the end of World War II, a lot of people had a say in a lot of institutions, right? There was unions, there were, there's elective governments and representatives and stuff. And so a lot of people had a lot of say in the way institutions work. And as soon as people had a lot of say, they were like, well, and they saw how bad institutions could be, there became these moral standards for how institutions are supposed to behave, right?
We also had media that covered this stuff, right? So therefore, a level of responsibility could be forced on organizations and bureaucracies, et cetera,
Right.
because it was
Right.
observable, right? But the good old days were not the good old days, right? Before all this time we're talking about, the world was a very cold, brutal place, right?
Yeah.
Where might made right.
Right. Well, and that's sort of the thing, right? There are pros and cons to everything, right? And as much as people don't want to admit that something that they find abhorrent, could have benefits, there are some. They don't always outweigh the costs, but they're present, right? And for instance, in the 1700s, like I said, most countries in Europe were not elective. They were monarchies. They were mostly centralized monarchies where the king and a small group of advisors had a lot of authority over their countries, right? and the local lords might have some sort of intermediary function within that, right? And what that did was it meant that if there was starving in the countryside, there was not really anything the peasants could do about it. You couldn't lobby the government to get more food, right? You can't say, oh, well, I don't want to go fight this war right now. Don't conscript my people, right? You don't have any say in what this government is going to go off to do. On the other hand, war in the 1700s was incredibly mild compared to the wars of, say, the 19th and 20th century. 18th century warfare was you got a group of guys in their little line formation. We'd go find a hill or a field or something. We'd shoot at each other until the other side ran away, and then we win that battle. And then everybody would go to the map at the end of 5 years or whatever when the war was fought, and they'd exchange 5 different chunks of land and say, all right, we signed these treaties and call it a day. That's so not how people understand war now, right? Every war is either some colonial venture where you're just oppressing some small country, or it's a fight of life or death, right? People can't comprehend the idea because the state has to make this promise of we're going to win, right? And what does a victory look like? Because I need to sell this to my population. I need to get them invested in victory. I have to promise them something tangible in return. And when you do that, you have to mass mobilize people, because there's this sinkhole economics idea of we need to win this, right? And you see this all throughout World War I and World War II. Nobody's willing to cut a peace deal because I already told everybody we're winning and that we're going to win and there's going to be this grand victory. We're getting everything we want. And if I can't provide that, they're going to overthrow the government, right? That doesn't happen in 17th century warfare. I can just go fight a small battle, say, well, we lost, and go home, right? And way less people die.
For some frame of reference, in the 18th century, you could be at war with another country and you could go on vacation there. You could still trade there. And so war was just fought between kings, and they'd all
the professional armies.
Yeah, it was volunteer army.
Right, very small.
Conscript people, and it didn't affect a daily person's life. And this is another thing. This is also why politically almost every system defaults onto monarchy. In monarchies establish an incentive structure to rule for your entire life and to pass on a stable country for your descendants. And you need to have a very well-educated, property-owning, cohesive population for democracy to work. And the reason the US was the first full suffrage majority voter democracy in history is the US was the first country in history where the average person was a property-owning, literate person, which established an incentive because you bought into the system. You could also know what was going on. And another thing is that people in modernity have no concept of how free people, even in autocratic societies, were in the pre-industrial world. One of my friends, he used to be a California congressman, and he was talking to one of another friends, and this friend said, "You've never experienced real freedom. My ancestors built 9 farms from Pennsylvania to Illinois in the 19th century, never signed paperwork, just did it.
Right.
You have to appeal to the government to put a mosquito fly on your back porch." And so this creates this kind of sense of extreme anger and repression to modernity, because we're all ants in a giant machine. And the biggest problem we have, again, is the combination of autism and hysteria, where we can't have real conversations about this is a corporation's self-interest. Corporations will make money until someone stops them. The government will expand until someone stops them, because the hysteria gets in the way. They say, oh my God, how could you say that? It's so offensive. But also there's the autism side of it, where we think, okay, these are our 2 choices. We have to win or lose. We must pick one of them. We have to make a policy with extremely tight provisions that won't work at all. And so we combine this hysterical inability to deal with anything emotionally with an extremely limited mental framework. You smash that together and it's ineffective.
Right. And that's, first of all, Rudyard and I are not advocating that America become an autocratic state, just in case that wasn't clear. I want to
we're all classical liberals here.
Right.
My worry, though, is that that's naturally going to happen because we don't respect the things that are necessary to a functioning democracy.
Well, right. And that's something, right. And of course, we've said this, but that's exactly something that happened to the Roman Republic, right? Where over time, it didn't, the institutions that needed to be respected in order to have a functioning democracy were actively undermined or ignored, right? And that's one of the problems that even I have is, right, as somebody who grew up in a very low economic bracket, who was on welfare for most of my childhood, middle class people are insufferable in a lot of ways to me, you know, because they always want to get the state involved, right? And as a poor person, when you grow up in a low income community, we're all doing things, or most of us are doing things that are not necessarily legal, right? For whatever the reason is. And so we don't really want the state to get involved, because it's kind of this mutual understanding of like, look, you know, we're all doing stuff that maybe we shouldn't. Let's just keep that between us, right? But the middle class people want to keep everything squeaky clean. And so they always want to get the state involved, right? You always knew in high school or middle school when, you know, that one or two kids who came from middle class families, right? Because the way they'd carry themselves and talk about it, and, you know, they had nice stuff and they'd have like a pool in their backyard or whatever. It's like, all right, you know, let's not mess with that kid, because, you know, his parents will be you know, a bitch to deal with. But the middle class is 100% necessary for a functioning democracy. If you don't have a middle class in the modern era,
This is an invested, rule following, productive group that is cohesive and tries to keep the country going in the right way. Right?
And like I said, and I use this word because I'm intentionally being derogatory, but they're whiny, right? They lobby the government. When
you don't
the middle
like
class
okay.
is right, exactly. When the middle class is unhappy with something going on, they vote, they go to town meetings, they do whatever, right? They interact with the government to get what they want, right? And you can tell that you need them in order for a functioning democracy, because poor people don't care. We don't think the government's going to listen to us anyways. And rich people have what they want, you know? So those two people don't really interact with the government that much. The middle class, in order to survive as an economic bracket, needs to lobby the government to make sure they get what they need to survive, you know?
So to that point, 50% of Americans don't pay federal income tax.
Mm-hmm.
They have this sort of bifurcated classes, right? Of people who make good money, people who are very rich, and then half the people who don't pay any federal income tax, et cetera, and don't feel that connected. They usually don't feel that, they feel powerless. They don't have like it. They don't have a wheel. They can't make things.
2/3 of Americans can't pay $400 for an emergency.
Right, which is insane.
So another 2/3 of fourth graders are functionally illiterate.
Right. So, but now you have an underclass, the poor class, wanting to count on the government to take care of them. Right. And when you have the power of the vote, one man, one vote, you can vote stuff for yourself. And we tend to vote for things that we want right now, out of emergency, out of immediacy, right? We don't want to delay gratification. We need what we need when we need it. We need it right now. And whether that has a long-term negative effect on our economy, on our educational system, on our people, we want what we want now.
So to sort of circle back to the point I made earlier, right, about the trade-off of, in the medieval era, you'd have a farm and stability, but no opportunity. And now there's not a lot of stability, but there's supposed to be a lot more opportunity. Part of that trade-off as well is, like I said, right, businesses don't encourage entrepreneurialism, right? They don't encourage you to come up with your own business, right? That's not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to work within my business and make me wealthy, right? As such, as you expand corporations and expand bureaucracy and expand the government, right, and they intervene in all these different areas, right, these large impersonal bureaucracies full of paper pushers, what you find is that, right, poor people and middle-class people and whoever else, right, will bump into, right, students will bump into these instances where the world is just sort of working and these gears are turning and you can't really get a handle on them. And nobody at any step of the process encourages you to do that. No one anywhere wants you or encourages you to step up and try to do something about the systems as they are.
Other than to tear it down.
One of the things that shocks me is that Gen Z can't really do anything. And Marek and I were talking about this, where Gen Z people are scared to take phone calls. They're scared to tell someone that they like them romantically. Like, the strategy of modern dating is, don't ask a girl on a date, ask her to hang out, sleep with her, then parlay that into, like, then you end up in a situationship where you two are kind of talking, but you don't, because actually making an
I am
overture.
stunned by all of this. It's hysterical to me.
Actually making an overture that is just too stressful.
It
And
would be hysterical if it didn't mean that a massive portion of our population is effectively dysfunctional and incapable of human interaction.
yeah,
You
but
know?
I'm saying is Gen Z
No, it's a
is
huge
too
loss.
stressed. They're too anxious to procreate because
Right.
to actually procreate, you have to be able to open with your emotions. You have to let someone else into your life, then make a shared space where you can
Share
have
and commit.
kids and raise them. But what I see with Gen Z is that the idea of I need to have my life together enough to have kids, it's just shocking because the only thing they're trained to do is perform rote tasks where they're like, wait, I'm supposed to be mature enough that I can provide a household and let someone else in my life. The only thing I was taught to do was how to fill out paperwork and compute what blank algebra thing is.
And I think that in the 80s, right, you mostly had these systems like we have them now have sort of crystallized, but there was not the technology on the same level in the 1980s. So parents could still sort of give a sense of initiative to the kids because they still have sort of an understanding of the situation that these kids are walking into. Now, parents are so disconnected from what their kids can do. I have 5 younger siblings, right? And I remember sitting there in absolute amazement. I got my first cell phone when I was 14. I remember looking in absolute amazement as my like 3-year-old brother was operating this iPad probably better than I could, you know, and it's just completely insane, right? What are you supposed to do? How do you tell your child how to go into the world when you don't even know how to do the things that they're doing? When you're so disconnected from the way they're living their lives, how could you possibly give them meaningful advice? And it's really difficult now because, of course, you're like, well, and technology has made things so easy. It's really frustrating, right, as Gen Z to watch older people complain about how, you know, kids don't go outside to play anymore. And it's like, well, first of all, you guys put me in front of a screen my whole life. You guys made sure
all
that
of
there
this
was
was
a
caused by something. And complain about kids going out. It's not complaining against the kid. They're complaining to the situation. It would be nice if a kid could go outside and play all day and not be stuck in front of a screen, playing, you know, and was actually interacting with other human beings.
right. It would
in the room. When you're in a room with other people nowadays, whether they're old or they're young, they're going to be on their phone. They're going to be disconnected. They're going to be texting and whatever. They don't tend to be present for the people in the room enough.
Yeah.
That's true. And I want to get back to one of the points, though. There was a faith and a confidence that things were going to be okay, even if you were poor back in the day. And you just said, I'm going to get married and it's going to be all right. And we'll work it out. And we may struggle, but it's going to be okay. That is not the case. What Rutger said is true. People say, well, I got to get my blank together well enough before I'll even think about that. So they are disincented to either commit and or to procreate. And therefore, if you don't have a nuclear family, I didn't grow up in a nuclear family. You didn't. You grew up in a nuclear, but we're both.
I wasn't either.
Okay. All right. So, you know, it's not good. I mean, I'd like to think that we turned out okay, despite I didn't have a father. But it would be better if we did. But now we're told you can have kids on your own. You don't need a man in your life, right? Men are actually toxic. They're bad. You shouldn't have one around. We need to figure out how sperm banks can replace.
Dave sent me an incredible text that I need to find my phone to read it back. Actually, no, it's in my messages. We can edit this out if you don't want to be seen as this red pilled. But
okay, well, I'm a little bit red pilled, but I'm also a child of the '70s. You know, I mean, I marched for and led a protest for the ERA. Okay, I consider myself an about feminist, raised by a single mom, 3 kids, all that. Okay, but Dave, that doesn't mean that I don't take umbrage at the fact that I'm being told now that I shouldn't exist and men should be replaced because they're completely unnecessary and evil.
Dave texted me, men keep you from doing what you want. They don't enable it. Only settle down when you need a beast of burden to help raise your kids. If you have money, men are pointless. They made sperm banks to make them obsolete.
Yeah. There's a certain amount of truth to that. That's the way it makes you feel if you're a young man. Or I remember back in the day, you know, why do I need you? Why do I want to be around you? Because you can provide for me. That was the role of the man back in the day. Can you reach the top shelf and will you kill a spider? I mean, will you take out the trash, et cetera, right? Are you there to defend me if something bad happens? Okay. Great. Well, now I don't need you for any of that. And as a matter of fact, you're oppressing me. You're keeping me from doing what I wrote this book on dating called The Official Nice Guy's Guide.
I've read it. It's very good.
That I sent him. And one of the tests I had for women, if they were sane or not, was you ask a woman, if I'm God, and let's pretend I'm God, and I can bring the perfect man or the perfect mate in your life next morning, 8 o'clock. You're gonna knock on the door. Do you want me to do that? Yes or no? Right now, say yes, and it'll happen. And women, especially young women, said no. Over 60-something% of the women said no, because I want to do X. And I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, I want to go to Europe first and I want to study. Go, the guy lives in Europe. He's got a chateau. I'm God, remember? Okay. Oh, I want to do this. I want to do that. He goes, no, I mean, well, I don't want to get married for this length of the time. There was a feeling that I could just find the perfect guy at the right time whenever I wanted it, was sort of the magical thinking, right?
Yeah.
That as opposed to, this is the right guy, let's go ahead and get married. This right gal. And it's really disconcerting. And then lately, it's becoming more and more caustic. It's being more and more the norm to believe that men are actually a bad thing in your life. And growing up in some Black neighborhoods in particular, this people may not like this, I found that in the poor Black communities, the Black women treated their men less respectfully, etc. And in many cases, it was deservedly so. Daddy wasn't around, right? All right. So we've got to figure out how to heal this divide between men and women generally, right? And especially in this young generation. And we have to be able to heal the divide, this confidence level that I can't get engaged, I can't become committed, I can't have a relationship, and I can't marry and have children unless everything in my life is perfect.
Yeah, right. I mean, the problem is, of course, ever since 1950, there's always been this propagandistic idea of your life will be perfect, right? And everything is going to be good, and there's infinite opportunity, and there's infinite resources, and whatever you need is going to be available to you going forward, right? And of course, that's just not what reality is. And I think by 1975, people started to come to realization that, okay, yeah, this is not going to work out with infinite resources and infinite opportunity and infinite, there is very limited opportunity. There are very limited resources. There are very limited ways to go about life.
Kurt says 7 great lies.
Yeah.
Modernity is built on 7 lies, but continue, Marek.
Yeah. But, this is one of the things that we are having to sort of reckon with as a society that has, in a sense, no good way to deal with it. Women historically have not had the opportunities and the freedoms that they have today. There is little to no historical precedent that can be, carefully studied in detail where women have had this much opportunity. And even in places, right, like the Nordic countries, medieval Nordic countries were very good to their women by the standards of the time and even by the standards of today, but they don't have a great written record for us to look into. And even so, there was they didn't have the pill, right? That's a really big game changer, right? Birth control in many formats has outstripped anything it was before. And that is a huge game changer in the way that women particularly go about their lives. And right now they're in the workforce and they're doing all these things, right? And in general, none of this stuff is particularly problematic. No sane person, I think, looks at women entering the workforce and think, this is horrendous. This is the work of the devil, blah, 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 right? But it does open up a bunch of fields, right? And this is something that Rudyard and I have talked about a lot, where it opens up a lot of new things, right? New problems in society that are not being looked into and not being discussed. Because if you turn a critical eye to this sort of thing, right, to women entering the workforce and the impact that it has on them, to the impact that social media has on young girls, to the impact that the pill has on the relationship between men and women, you're being critical in a way that is now negative, right? It's bad that you would think about this in a way that could lead us to think that this is bad, right? And so you cannot even have the opportunity to think about this in a way that would think it's bad, because if you're doing so, it is going back to lead back to my oppression, right? And in a sense, I understand, right, because women implicitly understand, right, that I don't think it's a conscious thing, but it's sort of like an ingrained psychological thing where they've known for all of history, they've lived under pretty stringent rules, and anything goes wrong and they're going to go back to that. Right. And so it's like, well, don't do anything to criticize this because I don't want to go back to the days where I'm locked up in a house and have to have 8 kids. Right. And I can understand why some people would want to avoid that sort of a scenario. Right. I don't hold that against people. But if you don't look into things, if you don't actively attempt to understand it, right, then the suffering that goes on in the modern world will just be something that we can't do anything about. You know,
Let's finish up on this topic because this is really important. You're talking about the ability to have nuanced conversations,
right,
and to be able to point out the pros and cons of something without being either considered evil, oppressor, or an apostate, right?
Right.
Because you didn't drink the entire pill, right? The need to be completely accepted and to be made to feel completely right is a very human emotion, et cetera, right?
Right.
And it has risen to a level so strong now. If you do not accept me, I'm not sure what the word is I'm looking for here, but if you do not validate my view of myself and my world enough, then we're now enemies.
Right.
Yeah.
We can't have a nuanced conversation.
And people
that
like that,
censorship and all sorts of dysfunction in our life.
and people like that exist on both sides of the political spectrum. And it seems like that the number of people who feel that way is steadily growing, right? And social media 100% exacerbates this issue, right? Because you'll see people get into debates online, but what I think people don't really bring up a lot of, and that I see a lot of with Rudyard's videos, for instance, is you can comment whatever you want and say, yeah, I was right, and just walk away from it and put down whatever you wanted in that comment section or on somebody's post or whatever it is, right? And just say whatever you want to say about whatever was posted and walk away from that believing you were right. And nobody's there to push back, right? You can
Well, you're not you're not there to hear the feedback, and you
right.
would never accept it. If
I don't have to return to that post, right? If somebody says something about, you know, anything about race relations, about the relations between the sexes, whatever it is, right? Even something, you know, innocuous, like who's the presidential elections, right? You can go in and say, well, I don't like Trump because he did this and blah, 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 right? And you believe that's correct, but you can post that comment and then continue scrolling and never go back to that post and never hear any criticism for the thought that you gave. Yes. You never have to reevaluate the opinion that you just gave because it's never going to come back to you. Nobody can hold you accountable for that opinion that you had.
Well,
right.
And so the only accountability is, will your account be shadow banned? Will you be locked out?
Right. Right. Exactly. Right. Corporations are the only thing that can hold you accountable. Right. And my thing is, right, and Rudyard and I both agree on this, is that I don't think it's healthy for a society for individuals to only be held accountable by impersonal bureaucracies. That's not great, right? That's just not good.
One of the things that
you have no recourse, and you have no recourse.
No, right. You can't.
You have no recourse.
One of the things that pisses me off, where like I can normally talk to a human being for any organization. For most things, I can talk to a human being, and because I'm a 21-year-old who I can like share my circumstance and then get some sort of like deal. Like I got in my new place in Texas, which is, I like it, but I wouldn't be able to get in as a normal 21-year-old. But I could tell them I run a YouTube channel and a business and I've done stuff, and they seem, okay, you seem responsible. But for my car insurance, I'm paying this horrific fee because I'm a 21-year-old. I got into one accident last year, and they're like, okay, statistically, this kid's going to have an accident. And you can't talk to anyone that's the case with I think it's nuts that Marek and I nearly slipped through the cracks of the school system. And the point I think I'm going to end on is modernity's subconscious drive is towards turning people into cogs for the machine, because that's what makes the most money. And you see this with corporations pushing advertising, with the government, with the education system. We're all trying to turn us into cogs, but that strips away culture and identity. And the reason they like femininity is because women, they're less aggressive, they're more agreeable, and they're more emotional. So they're easier to manipulate, and they hate masculinity because if you push against a man's authority too much, he'll slap back at you. But the thing with women is that women once they have children, they care a lot about the children and they stop being so easily malleable. So our society tells women to never have children. But the problem with industrial civilization that we've run into is we've stripped away humanity. So our birth rate's not functional, and the world's population is going to collapse by half over the next 60 years. But we have no functioning social institutions. So people in my age group, they can't go outside, they can't have kids, they can't make art. And we're going to see the modern era and all the cultural technologies since the French Revolution, whether industrialism, the idea of equality, liberty, brotherhood, they're all going to come crashing down over the next century. And I hope that through real conversations like this, that we can establish something to come after it.
And that's
So
another thing that really breaks society as well, right? Is that institutions and large bureaucracies do not want people to be entrepreneurs. They don't want them to have initiative and think freely, right? But what you have online, especially I would say with people who are Gen Z and people who are millennials, but I think you definitely see it in older generations too, is this idea, right, that everybody sort of knows that they want you to be a cog in the machine, right? There's large bureaucracies that want things to run in a certain way, and they'd like everybody to just go along with it, right? And everyone thinks that they know, right? Aside from maybe college educated people, but everyone, you go online and everyone says, I'm outside the box, right? I'm not the cog in the machine. I know, right? I know what's up. I know the secrets, right? And they think, you know, so if you're not with me, then you're the cog in the machine and you're the problem, right? I found enlightenment. I am correct. And
Yes.
you're wrong for holding an alternative opinion, right? And both sides do this. You see people on the right. It's always funny to go into Rudyard's comment section, right? And there will be people there who won't even say anything related to what Rudyard covered in the video, right? But there'll be these right-wing people who be like, yeah, well, you know, and all these sheeple will be out there and they just want to believe this and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, this is complete nonsense, right? I don't
paid by the Jews. They say I am
right.
They say I am funded by the Jews, by the Military Defense Fund, by I'm a CIA hack, by and that I'm paid for by the liberals to destroy the conservatives. And I'm sad to say, no one is paying for me. No one's funding my opinions.
Yeah.
If you want to give me a couple of mil,
yeah,
we can talk.
I think a lot of what you guys have talked about here are fundamentally true. This is very interesting concept. Yeah. I think we're largely in agreement, maybe not on everything and maybe not to the same degree. That's fine. That's the point of the discussion. We have to insist that we can have nuanced conversations and disagree, that we have to question everything, that censorship is evil, right?
And that's something that
have all the answers, and we have to be willing to question our own fundamental beliefs. And the people that I think who believe that they are the smartest, who think they know, are the least open-minded,
yes,
on the planet. And to your point, Marek, everyone seems to think they're the one who knows, right? And everybody else is an idiot. I'm the only one who's, you know, cosmopolitan and enlightened and brilliant and whatever, or pragmatic and whatever. So, two things: we have to insist on being able to have nuanced conversations. Censorship is evil, right? That I'll get over if you say something I disagree with. I'll get over it. It probably won't break my brain. It'll be okay, right?
Yeah.
And that we have to figure out ways to get along and come to some sort of agreement on. And let's not give up our principles. There are certain fundamental things we're told every day that just aren't true. And you have to go, wait, okay. I'm without getting political, the classic example is this. There is a group of people here that want you to call them a male or a female, but they are unwilling to define what that is.
Yes.
Okay. I'll call you whatever you want. I don't care what pronoun you want to be used. If you're polite to me, I'm going to call you whatever pronoun you want to be. I'll call you pink rabbit. I'll call you sir, ma'am, whatever. I'm good with that. But let's agree. If you want to be called that, can you not at least, you know, agree on what that is, and that there are certain fundamental differences between men and women? If we can't have that broad discussion respectfully,
yeah.
So this
we're not a nation anymore. We're not a society.
Yeah. The analogy, or the, you know, whatever you want to call it, that I like to draw, right, is that the universe is infinitely complex, right? There's a lot of ways you can interpret anything that goes on, right? And nothing is nothing that we think of as real is really real. But we have to pretend it is. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get anything done or do anything or go anywhere, right? If we can't all just say, the leaves are green, then you'll never be able to farm. You'll never be able to plant anything, right? You're never going to be able to just move forward in any direction because we can't even agree that the leaves are green. And so people put things into sort of idea boxes, as I'll call them, right? Is like you have this idea of like, okay, this is what green is. And we're all going to say that this stuff is green and we're going to put it in this box and this is the green box and everything in here is green, right? And we do the same thing for gender, right? This is what a woman is. And everything, all these traits come together in this idea of what a woman is in this box, right? And what happens is over time, as things change, right, the ideas in the box need to be explored because these boxes get old. They don't make any sense. They're disconnected from the way the world is now. And so you got to open up the box and you have to look at what's in the box and kind of go through, okay, and say, is this what, we need from females? Is this what fish really are, now that we've discovered new species, right? Whatever the idea is, right? Does this box actually make sense anymore? And we've hit a point in society where the right is using boxes that are basically were made between like 1870 and 1950, right? And a lot of times the right is unwilling to open those boxes, criticize those boxes, or look at them in any way that could damage those boxes or mean that we'd have to make new boxes, right? That's horrifying to them. They'd rather just keep the boxes shut. Everything has to work like it did between 1870 and 1950, right? Now, the left, normally what the left is supposed to do is open up the boxes and say, hey, maybe we need new boxes. These ideas don't really make a lot of sense, right? Instead, what the left is doing is just opening the boxes, dumping everything on the floor and saying, well, that's out there now, and we should never put them back in a box. It's a crime for you to put ideas and people into boxes. And it's like, I understand why you believe that. There is a sort of logic chain that exists to justify doing that. But if you dump everything out of a box and you can't have ideas around what this thing is, we're never going to be able to do anything because it becomes instantly more complicated than if you had it in a box. If you don't have an idea of what a woman is or what a man is or what a fish is, it becomes impossible to move forward in any direction regarding that idea. And it was always really crazy to me that instead of trying to disregard or redo or even get rid of the concept of gender, instead what it looked like people do is they're like, what if we made 60 of these? What if we just took the concept of gender, dumped it on the floor and said, anything can be a gender now, right? And it's like, why would you make this more complicated, right? Weren't you trying to avoid being a label? It wasn't the label the problem, and now you're like, well, now we need a million labels.
All that's fundamentally true. Do we have to kill each other over it?
I hope not.
Okay, no, but we seem to, right? So whether it's dumping it all in a box and getting rid, dumping on the floor and getting rid of all kinds of delineations, whether it's keeping things as they were in the 50s or whatever, regardless, I'm not advocating for one or the other. I'm saying we are now willing to go to blows over and hit each other over and to tear ourselves apart over this. Is it okay for us to disagree? No, it's not. You have to agree with me. You have to validate my worldview. And if you don't, we are going to go to war.
This is why societies fall to dictatorships, right? Is because when you cannot have discourse about ideas that are critical to your society, and you can't move past that, one side with a certain set of ideas will attempt to overpower the other side and install somebody to provide uniform thought throughout the land, right?
One of the things that gets me is that none of the left's criticisms are good faith. You actually go through, modernity is incredibly gullible. You go through the writings of the big postmodernist and Frankfurt School philosophers. They all literally said that this is made to be a wedge against this previous society. It's a tactic, but we're too gullible to see it. But also what I think, and I'll stop the recording, we need to wrap up, but no one likes modernity. And you see this in both the right and the left. They both think the system's horrible and broken, but there's people are looking for excuses to kill each other, to get to David's point, because their lives, they hate themselves so much and they hate the world so much. And people pick bullshit to basically...
And they have nothing better to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Fat and happy, or unhappy, fat and unhappy.
And Rudyard and I have said this before, and I'm sure we'll say it again, right? But there's a million problems in the world right now, and no one is taking responsibility for them, right? When you see the problems in the world, the left says it's because the right refuses to budge, and the right says it's because all the changes the left is trying to make. It's not my fault, right? It can't be my fault. I can't be held responsible for these things, right? And this is a mindset that comes from having all these bureaucracies that prevent anybody from taking responsibility, right? There's all this paperwork and red tape between me and any level of responsibility, right? So when somebody talks about what's going wrong in society, you pick insert group here and blame them, right? Because it's got to be this group of people that is making things wrong. It couldn't be me. It can't be me. It's not my fault, right? And that is a huge problem, right? Is no one can stop and think to themselves, how could I be the problem, right?
So
how could I contribute?
The principles of the new society we'd like to live in takes responsibility for what it can take responsibility for, doesn't blame everyone else, is open-minded, questions its own thinking,
Yeah.
still sticks to some things that are fundamentally true, stands on principle, right? Is responsible for itself and self-reliant, doesn't ask everybody to take care of them, but is also willing to take care of those if they can.
All of those, right? All of those things that you just said are philosophical thoughts that have been carefully developed over the course of the West's history from like 1000 AD on. Those are all things you can find Western philosophies lauding as a good society, you know?
Okay.
Yeah.
So we do have to wrap it up. This is good. Let's all aspire to those things, right?
This is a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. We'll do it again sometime, I'm sure.